Welcome everyone to the Colombia Parallel session on illicit drug economies in conflict-affected borderlands. My name is Frances Thomson. I'm a researcher at SOAS on the Drugs and Disorder Project. And I'm just going to briefly introduce today's session and speakers. The purpose of this 1.5-hour parallel session is to share some country-specific research findings from the Drugs and Disorder Project. The Drugs and Disorder research in Colombia was led by our partner institution, the National University of Colombia, and specifically Professor Francisco Gutiérrez Sanín. Francisco is professor at the IEPRI, or Institute of Political Studies and International Relations at the National University of Colombia, and director of the Observatory of Land and Restitution and Agrarian Property Regulation. Also presenting today from Francisco's team is Luis Castillo. Luis is a research assistant at the National University within the Drugs and Disorder Project. Francisco and Luis will have an hour to present, and if there's time, to respond to any questions as well. Please write your comments and reflections into the general chat and your questions into the specially designated chat box. In the final half hour of the session, we'll hear from Ana, Sarah, and Maria Alejandra on behalf of CESED, or the Center for Studies of Security and Drugs at Los Andes University in Bogotá. CESED is also a drugs and disorder partner institution, and the CESED team have been leading on policy engagement, but have also been doing some research for the project, which Maria Alejandra, Ana, and Sarah will tell you more about. Arjona is associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University in the United States, and associate researcher at CESED. She was also the director of CESED in 2018 and 2019, which is how we had the opportunity to connect with Ana. And it's through Ana that we've connected with Sarah Moore. Sarah is studying for a PhD in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University, and is also a predoctoral fellow at Los Andes University. And last but definitely not least, we have María Alejandra Vélez. María Alejandra is associate professor at the Department of Economics at Los Andes University, senior research fellow of the Environment for Development Network, and current director of CESED. The final part of the session is quite squeezed, so we've not scheduled a question and answer session, but please do use the Hop In People tab to get in touch with Maria Alejandra, Sarah, and Ana directly, and please add your questions and comments to the chat, all the same, as we can pass these on to the speakers. So without further delay, Francisco, the virtual floor is all yours.
Many thanks, Francis. Do you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. Perfect. I will share my screen. Wait a sec. Okay, research. But I don't find my talk. Do you see it?
Yes, I can see the presentation,
Perfect.
but it's quite small. Maybe if you put it in presentation mode, then we can see it better.
Let's see if I can do it.
That's perfect, yeah.
Yeah, right. Perfect. So first of all, many thanks, Francis, for the kind presentation. Many thanks to all the team, the Universidad de Los Andes, etc., etc. Today, we will present 3 talks. I will give a general overview of what we did during this process. Then Luis will make a comparison of the political economy of coffee and coca at the Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta. And then I will speak about coercive brokerage, which is a kind of characterization of the role which the paramilitaries and the paramilitaries linked to coca and marijuana crops in the Sierra Nevada and elsewhere built the state and became the main intermediaries between region and central state in Colombia during years. I have to say that we are not speaking about tobacco, which was a fundamental aspect of this session, because our brilliant colleague, Diana Machuca, had a health issue and then she could not attend. So this is why I will deliver two presentations because originally the idea was that I would give the overview, then Luis would speak, and then Diana would speak. Okay, so without further ado, then I will give this short overview. So what I will do is simply to speak about the main ideas which guided us during this research and their outputs and the results, which I hope will show that this was a hugely constructive and fruitful project for us, for Colombia. And I think that in this sense, the project fulfilled its objectives fully. So the first idea was in which we are working on still is the characterization of illegal peasantries, basically coca and marijuana peasantries in Colombia. This illegal peasantry is a major sector in Colombian agriculture, at least since the end of the 1970s until today, and is constituted by tens of thousands of families. And basically, the two arguments that we have forwarded is that on the one hand, the legal sector is not necessarily better in terms of violence, in terms of land distribution, etc., and that due to this, the illegal sector in Colombia, the illegal agricultural sector in Colombia, has some crucial advantages that allow the peasants to fulfill some vital demands, and thus this puts both peasants and the country vis-a-vis a very tough trade-off in the sense that the peasants have to pay prohibitive costs due to the involvement, of course, by definition, in an illegal activity. But on the other hand, they can, through this involvement, they can advance, at least in some crucial senses, their life trajectories and their livelihoods. And we have a lot of sources here, life histories, archival research. We made two major surveys in Puerto Asís and Tumaco, the first one and the second one in Tumaco. And the output is we produce articles for Análisis Político, Estudios Sociojurídicos, by the way, in a special issue in which María Alejandra Vélez presented with a co-author also an excellent article, the International Journal of Drug Policy in the Third World Quartet. Then the second main idea is the characterization of real existing alternative development and its relationship with peace and war. So drawing on what I just said, the idea is that the developmental impacts of substitution are imagined based on an assumption that the legal sector is Pareto superior to the illegal sector, and then that if you could build a policy for the peasants that lure them away from illegality, everything would be better. But it is clear that these policies have not worked in the Colombian context. Actually, they do not work in many other contexts. And what we have shown is that there is also a political economy of alternative development that makes it objectively difficult, and sometimes it produces more problems that it solves. And because of what we're showing here, the underlying political dynamics of long policies, the strong continuity between counterinsurgent and peace-oriented policies, violence against social leaders, and the, let's say, social and political effects of undertaking at the same time aerial spraying and violent substitution, and on the other hand, so-called alternative development. And actually in Colombia, this may sound a little bit as a blasphemy, but actually in Colombia, one could say that real existing alternative development has been related to the broadening of the agrarian frontier as the promise to social advancement. So what here we have a very, very rich set of empirical evidence. I have to say that we made a survey at the beginning of the setting up of the PENIS, which was the alternative development policy created by the peace agreement between the government and the main Colombia guerrilla, the FARC. And we made a survey among the same population in Tumaco at the end, at the de facto end of the policy a couple of months ago. So we are still processing this to make an evaluation and produce the outputs. Here we also published in several international journals and also reports for the SHA and for the observatory. In third place, we developed a couple of ideas about the relationship between economic criminality and war, which you know has been a theme that has been at the center of intellectual debates in the last 20 or 30 years. So for authors like Collier, etc., of course, they are not already at the cutting edge, but anyway, they had a huge influence, and they still have some influence among the policy community and de facto policy decisions. And many people still assume, at least implicitly, that the sum of criminality and politics is not a constant. So what we have been, that the sum of criminality and politics is a constant. What we found is that it is not a constant, that in many senses, the non-state armed groups that participated and have been participating in the Colombian War obtained some political entry points in forms of politicization through their link with narco traffickers, through their link with illicit crops, and that does what one could, making this kind of analogy with another academic discipline, what one could call the three bodies problem is an open problem. Here we made a workshop in which first-class academics, Michael Mann, Jenny Bruce, etc., participated, and we will publish a special issue. I think that actually it's already in process of publication, at least in the web, with the Journal of Power and Politics, and probably we will go on with this. Then I will not go into this because I will present it afterwards. Let's say around the notion of coercive brokerage, we have been playing around with some ideas related to the intermediation between territory, especially borderland territories, and the national decision-making center, and how paramilitaries and also illegal economies shape this. And we also have been working around regional trajectories and how large-scale change was experienced by concrete people in these regions. This is still something we are working on it. There's a lot to think about it, both empirically and conceptually and methodologically. We are also working with the health research colleagues. I will not go into this as well because there is a special session on it. And we have a couple of pending issues which I am very enthusiastic about. The working on peasant sociability and the change and continuity of peasant sociability at the expanding agrarian frontiers, and also the mutual relationship between illegal crops who were in state formation. I have to say that one very important outcome of all this project has been the unfolding of the thinking and development of quite a robust set of early careers researchers who contributed very fundamentally to the project. Mónica Parada, Camilo Acero, who are doing their PhDs. In the context of this project, we developed 3 master theses. These early careers researchers made a host of publications in good journals. They participated in different international events, and they also participated in academic, but also in policy debates in the Colombian public space. So all this was very fruitful and constructive. So I will let it here, and then maybe Luis can go on.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning and afternoon to all. I am Luis Castillo, and I've been working with the National University team in the Drugs and Disorder project. In this presentation, I will compare 2 agrarian economies that coexist in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which are coffee and coca. Next slide, please. So this comparison aims to show that despite their similarities, coffee and coca developed different political economies in the Sierra. And this was so not only because of its legal status, but also because of its relation to the armed conflict. Next slide. So the presentation is divided into 2 main sections. In the first one, I will refer to the things that these 2 economies have in common, and then I will compare their political economies in terms of their difference with 3 powerful local actors, armed groups, other agrarian elites, and political elites. Next slide. These ideas are based on several sources. First, extensive archival research, which included reviewing historical local press and archives of both national and regional institutions. And second, judicial documentation, including both judgments and case files. And third, a fieldwork for almost 2 years in the Sierra Nevada. Next slide, please. So let me begin by looking at these 2 economies. This is a map of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, and as you can see, it has 3 sides, north, west, and east. I will focus on the first 2, that is the northern and western sides, which are located mainly in the department of Magdalena. Most of the land in the department is dedicated to large-scale cattle ranching and agro-industrial banana production. So this region of the Sierra is the only mountainous area of Magdalena. Coca was cultivated mainly on the northern side of the Sierra, along that coastal area shown at the top of the map, while coffee is produced mainly on the western side. Now, these 2 economies have several characteristics in common. First, both were economies of expansion of the agricultural frontier. In the case of the western side, there were 2 major processes of settlement and expansion of this frontier associated with coffee. The first took place at the beginning of the 20th century and was associated with the establishment of large coffee plantations by European immigrant families. It is at this time when commercial coffee production really began in the Sierra. The second process took place between the 50s and the 70s, when thousands of peasants arrived in the region, running away from the bipartisan violence that was taking place in the Andean region of the country. In the case of the northern side, the expansion of this frontier was much more recent. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the local elites established large cattle ranches in the lowlands. This attracts some peasants to the region, but not many, because cattle ranching, as is well known, generates little rural employment and is not very profitable on sloping lands. Coffee was not an option either. It does not grow well in these lands due to the very humid climate. And in addition to this, access to the region was very limited by the lack of roads. As a result of all of this, it took longer to populate and incorporate the midlands and highlands of the northern side of the Sierra into the agrarian production. So, the expansion of the agricultural frontier on this region really began with the illicit crops, first with the cultivation of marijuana in the 70s, and then with coca in the 80s. Many peasants arrived attracted by these economies, but also by the construction of a road that greatly improved the connection of the region. This road is called Troncal del Caribe, and you can see it at the top of the map as the white line that runs from side to side along the northern side of the Sierra. So, in both coffee and illicit crops, the peasants found a great opportunity to make a living. On the one hand, land was highly unavailable resource. Yes, they needed an enormous amount of work to clear the forest and civilize the land, but it was something most peasants were willing to do. On the other hand, these were products well connected to the market, which meant a relatively stable income and a modest capacity for accumulation for the peasants. In a few words, both cocoa and coffee allowed them to stabilize in the region as peasants. But these economies also share other things. Just to mention them, both have land tenure structures where small and medium producers have an enormous weight and importance, and both are labor intensive, which implies that they trigger a great economic dynamic in these regions. Now, let me turn to the differences, which are also quite significant. Next slide, please. First, there is the relationship with the armed groups. It must be said that both regions experience territorial control by armed groups. In the case of the western side, that is, the coffee-producing region, this control was exercised mainly by the guerrillas, who arrived in the Sierra in the early 80s. There was also a small period of paramilitary control around 2002 when they expelled the guerrillas and took over the area, but it was brief, just a few years, because the paramilitaries demobilized in 2006. In the case of the northern side, the coca-producing region, this armed control was always in the hands of the paramilitary groups that emerged in the mid-80s and commanded the area for almost 20 years. Now, the specific relationship of these groups with each economy was quite different. In the case of coffee, since it is a legal commodity, regulation depends entirely on state institutions and private actors such as the Coffee Growers Federation, so armed groups had little room to regulate this activity. Also, none of them became directly involved in the production or commercialization of coffee. Rather, they limit themselves to eventually charging a pay to some large producers and traders. It must be said, however, that the guerrilla extortion was really concentrated on other rural elites, not the coffee elites. In the case of coca, things were different because as an illegal product, it was necessarily outside the state regulation. And in the case of the Sierra, the paramilitaries assumed enormous regulatory functions, such as securing property rights and controlling the operation of the market. In that sense, they set a price for the coca base that the farmers produce and decided who, when, and where they could buy it. So one last difference has to do with the elites of this economy. The coffee elites did not ally with any of the armed groups. In the case of the guerrillas, it is easy to understand why. They look for support mainly in peasant sectors. And in the case of the paramilitaries, the coffee elites were never very interested in their offer of private security or social repression. In contrast, the elites of the coca economy, that is, the narcos, did have an organic link with the paramilitaries. The narcos not only funded and promoted the creation of this group, but were also very present in its leadership positions. And in turn, the armed structure was directly involved in the value chain, not only collecting taxes, but also managing and operating cocaine labs. This is also well documented in the judicial files. Next slide, please. Now, let's turn to the relationship with other agrarian elites. In the case of the coffee elites, their relationship with other agrarian elites was relatively weak and did not go beyond the commercial relations they may have had with other elites. In the case of coca, in contrast, the narcos made an alliance with other rural elites to deal with guerrilla attacks. This included mainly cattle ranchers and banana producers, and the state decided to support them. Thus, a regional counterinsurgency coalition was formed, and this was the support base for the already mentioned paramilitary group. But there were also other links to the agrarian elites. As is well known, land is an asset that facilitates money laundering, and in the case of the Sierra, there were several cases of narcos who became big cattle ranchers and vice versa. Next slide, please. The last difference I want to talk about is related to the political elites. In the case of the coffee region, the activity of the political elites was quite limited. On the one hand, the presence of the guerrilla increased the risk of doing politics and simply scared them away. The politicians that continued to engage in electoral politics were few and low profile. On the other hand, when the paramilitaries took over the region, they were never able to replace other powerful brokers, such as the Coffee Growers Committee. This committee had a significant influence in state agencies and had been aggregating and representing the interests of the coffee growers for decades, at least since the early 20th century. In contrast, in the coca growing region, there were strong links with the political elites of Magdalena. There were two reasons for this. First, several politicians joined this counterinsurgency coalition because they were also being attacked by the guerrillas. But here we are not talking about just any politicians. These were big regional bosses. One example of this is Edgardo Vives, a liberal politician who was mayor of the department capital, governor of the Magdalena, and congressman for many years. And he was a major supporter of the paramilitaries. The second reason is that in the case of the coca growing region, the paramilitaries did become powerful brokers, controlling on a large scale the access of peasants and inhabitants to electoral politics and state resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so to synthesize, I proposed a regional comparison of the political economy of two agrarian economies that coexist in the Sierra, coffee and coca. And I showed that despite their similarities, they differ greatly in their relationship with powerful local actors, such as armed groups, agrarian elites, and political elites. Now, I would just like to raise two final questions that I believe can contribute to the further discussions. First, we know that some of these powerful actors have links to illicit economies. So one should ask whether and how this relationship affects the implementation of anti-drug policy, including both forced eradication and alternative development. And also, in the second place, if we know that these actors are well connected and have great access to the state, what does this tell us about the way we understand the process of state exclusion and marginalization in the regions affected by illicit economies? That would be all. Thank you.
Hello. So could I share the screen or?
We can see your screen, coercive brokerage.
Okay, thank you, Francis.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So I will put it all again in screen mode. Do you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So I will develop, and this is intimately connected with what Luis was saying, this idea or concept of coercive brokerage. So the idea, and here I am drawing on my book called Clientelistic Warfare, my 2019 book, that as a paramilitarism, among many other things, was a clientelistic intermediation on steroids. So what were these steroids? Basically access to large means of violence and autonomous rents. But clearly they were building on a large tradition of political and sometimes violent intermediation between territory and central state in Colombia. So this is related to the process of state formation in the country and also of political regime formation and of its democracy. So there was an academic, Molin, who spoke about the bandits in Colombia in the 1960s and said that they survived due to the Bogota tie-in. So in a sense, the paramilitaries were working on this kind of Bogota tie-in, which allowed them to be protected from attacks by the army and by the security agencies from the states, and at the same time allowed them to operate in the territory and to build their legitimacy in the territory as people enabled by the central state. And note that this is different from the Tillian model of state formation, in which, for those of you who like films, this is Eisenstein in Ivan the Terrible. Let's say the central state destroys the resistance of the local authorities, and it creates its universalistic bureaucratic order. So understanding this unstable, complicated relationship between the paramilitaries and the central state as intermediaries allows us to take on board, which a lot of theories do not do, the major intra-paramilitary wars that took place since the 1980s until the demobilization of the paramilitaries and beyond, actually. It allows us to understand those demobilizations, and it allows us to understand also the complexities of intermediation. So, as Luis already highlighted, we had a massive, let's say we drew on massive judicial sources, at least 100 directly relevant for the paramilitaries who operated in the Sierra Nevada, but also more than 1,000 relevant for the conflicts and political economy of the Sierra Nevada. We also drew on massively on press, state archive, fieldwork, and in-depth interviews, including some of Hernán Giraldo operators, who was the main, Hernán Giraldo was the main paramilitary of the Sierra Nevada. So let's say simply as a main case of Hernán Giraldo, who was not necessarily the typical intermediary. Many of these intermediaries in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean coast, and also in the south of the country were cattle ranchers, etc. Hernán Giraldo was really a specialist in violence, mainly, who had migrated from the Andean core of the country to the Caribbean coast. And also, it's not necessarily the typical periphery in the sense that it was, as seen in this map, the hinterland of Santa Marta, which is a major city. And despite this, Giraldo was able to build a very, very stable fiefdom between the late 1970s and 2002, 2006. In 2002, he was overcome and defeated militarily by other paramilitaries. And in 2006, he was eventually extradited. And I have to say that besides he was a major, major sexual offender, perhaps the most egregious, even for, let's say, really incredible, even for paramilitary standards. So Giraldo is a very good case to think how these violent brokers were able to become political through their connection with illicit economies. So Giraldo really obtained, let's say, the political legitimation vis-a-vis politicians and these regional bosses that Luis was speaking about, thanks to the two major illegal bonanzas that took place in Santa Marta, marijuana and coca, marijuana in the 1970s. He became basically a security provider who coordinated producers and their workers and allowed them to overcome their collective action issues that were generally producing homicides and spiking violence. And then he became a protector of coca producers in the 1980s, protector between commas, of course. And he tried to build his image and was successful in this in front of the state and also of other rural elites, as in a bona fide anti-FARC self-defense. And then he became let's say, becoming a credible anti-subversive, he linked with prominent politicians, with rural elites, with, I omitted here, with state security agencies, through, for example, security cooperatives, the so-called Convivir, created by the state in the 1990s, and the intersection of all these. And in this sense, he picked up a very long tradition and a very long push by rural elites at the Sierra Nevada for some form of private access to large means of violence. Here, for example, I am quoting a telegram by Miguel Pinedo Barrios, who was a major regional boss in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, writing to the government ministry. At that moment, it was called government ministry, saying, by God, Mr. Minister, guarantee the defense of property rights. This actually was not against guerrillas, but against peasant movements through state organs, state agencies, because otherwise you will have to engage in personal defense, and we do not want to do this. And not by chance, his son became also a major regional boss and deeply engaged with Giraldo's network, and a famous and infamous, of course, parapolítico. That means a politician at service of the paramilitaries. So Giraldo developed several links with the state. This is very important because generally it's only the security agencies of the state are highlighted, but it's the panoply of links was much broader. On the one hand, local and departmental bureaucracies. Actually, Helvis was very famous, very important in his setup, and he was the intermediary between different local authorities to make businesses and the Giraldo group. So it was not only the Bogota tie-in, but also the Santa Marta tie-in. He had major regional bosses like Pinedo, like these. There are several politicians. He had his security cooperative. Jorge Noguera, who was the chief of the DAS. This is the security agency of the presidency, and he was a stooge of the paramilitaries, both of Giraldo and of his paramilitary adversaries, and very strong links with the army and the police, and also with civilian bureaucracies linked to tourism and the agrarian sector. By the way, as Teo Albe found with the Urabá paramilitaries, Giraldo was also intimately linked with the illicit crop substitution sector and acted hand in hand with it during the demobilization process. So what were these steroids all about, and what were their consequences? So let's say this access to large means of violence and narco rents allowed Giraldo to obtain anti-subversive legitimation and to obtain basically two results that were fundamental for the stability of his fiefdom. On the one hand, the building of what he called, he was very explicit on this, community controlled of a closed territory. So this immediately pushes one to think in terms of block, of Anton Bloch, his classic about the mafia in the Sicilian village. This does not mean it's not intended to suggest that the paramilitaries were a mafia in any reasonable sense, simply the power of being able to close a territory and on that grounds to negotiate with both local and territorial authorities and with the central state. And then this allowed him to offer offer the politicians and also the state access to resources, to voters, resources like coca to voters, and also to the territory itself. So the territory, that means to go through the territory and or to exclude people thinking the territory as a place of transit. This Giraldo's territorial control was communitarian, but at the same time extremely violent. Massacres, rapes, massive rapes. Sometimes these forms of violence were linked to this communitarian buildup. For example, typically he engaged in rape of very young girls and tried to build with the family of these young victims pseudo kinship relationships, and then create support among the community with them. And it's very important, and here I am almost ending. It's very important that this, let's say, while he was able to build this base power inside, within his fiefdom, outside he created a very powerful coalition whose composition is very important, and we are advancing in this, let's say, these new forms of intermediation, of violent intermediation, have their typical personnel. Actually, they also have their typical material culture, and we are working to understand this. So it was it was a mix of specialists in violence, narcos, regional intermediaries, basically rural plus political elites, civilian bureaucrats, and members of state agencies. Giraldo's demise was not caused once again in any reasonable sense by state pressure. Basically, it was the result of an intra-paramilitary war. The ultra-powerful northern bloc of the paramilitaries destroyed him and absorbed him without killing him, which is a kind of outlier. It had two main motives. On the one hand, the struggle around the narcotization of the Giraldo team and its killing of some DEA agents, and on the other hand, the problem of access to the territory, because the Bloque Norte was in this drive for expansion, and Giraldo was a hurdle to overcome. The state agencies in this intra-paramilitary war took sides and acted basically as a protection racket. But the most powerful guys within the army supported Giraldo. This is already very well documented. And finally, in 2006, he was extradited. And as I told you, before that, he headed a process of substitution hand in hand with the state agencies and with international agencies, very much in the spirit of what has been documented by Balbé in Urabá. And there's an afterlife to this, because after he was extradited, new groups appeared, what one could call paramilitaries 2.0, but this is already beyond this talk. So let's say as epilogue or conclusions, then the three-body problem, the relationship between paramilitaries, the state, and illicit economies is complex in the sense that it cannot be put in the terms of this simple equation that more criminal implies less political. In some senses, the link with the coca, the very strong link of Giraldo with the coca economy, undermined his politics. In other senses, it actually created them. There is a very strong change in continuity in this type of intermediation of the paramilitaries, but as I tried to show, this intermediation was actually different, but at the same time, it was, let's say, this relationship between region and this type of relationship between region and actually between borderland region and the state is at the heart of the process of state formation and of competitive politics in Colombia. And finally, that without taking this on board, it is very difficult to understand the continual problems of in collective action and social passes problems that the paramilitaries faced during their lifetime. A lot of theories are able to show the link of the paramilitaries with the state. I think it is simply impossible to understand them without taking the state on board. But at the same time, these collective action issues have to be explained, and I think that the notion of the paramilitaries as intermediaries helps to explain it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisco, and thank you, Luis, for these great presentations. So just looking at the clock, we should be moving on to the presentations from Los Andes at 2:40. So we have about 6 minutes for questions. It's not very long, but if people want to write their questions for Francisco and Luis in the chat, please do. And if you can't, they can't answer them now, maybe later on. We do have one question from Nicolas Martinez. He asks, was it possible to find in your research what is the position of coca growers about the regulation of coca and cocaine? I assume that means like legal regulation of coca and cocaine. Francisco, you're muted.
Thanks. Now, do you hear me? Yes. We went very deep into this, Nicolas, and some of the publications we did are exactly about this. Exactly as Jenny Pierce said, the coca growers reject the sallies of the state to fumigate, to attack them, and at the same time are permanently demanding regulation. So what one could say in a word, because we have only 6 minutes, let's say the demand of regulation has been a permanent demand of peasantries throughout the existence of the illegal crops in the country. Of course, the story is much more complex. Some peasantries have been able, or simply have not engaged in this type of crop. Some others have abandoned it through a very complex process. For example, Arauca had coca and was a coca hotspot during years, and finally abandoned it much before the peace process. But those peasants who are actually cultivating coca or marijuana were rejecting the, let's say, state violence, and at the same time demanding state regulation. And as Jonathan said as well, they were very much willing to make the transition to legality if some semblance of credible regulation, with the caveat that it maintains the social advances that they had gained in the process of broadening the agrarian frontier, was offered. And that is what the state has been unable to do up to now, to offer.
Thank you so much, Francisco. So I think I haven't seen any more questions in the chat, and in any case, it is time to move on, but please do write any questions you have for Francisco or Luis in the chat and we can get it to them. And you can also connect with them throughout the conference by clicking on people and then looking for them if you have, if you'd like to discuss their presentations with them. So thank you, Francisco and Luis. And now handing over to Anna, I believe is going to speak first, is that right? You're muted, Anna. We can't hear you, Anna. You're on, I think you're muted.
Anna, can you see the controls at the bottom? In the middle, it should be the microphone.
Oh dear.
Or you could try refreshing the page.
Well,
let's jump back in.
Okay, I think Anna's just sort of going out and coming back in to fix the problem. And I'm guessing that you have a particular order, Sarah and Anna, like it wouldn't work for you to go first, Sarah. Well, Anna's, oh no, she's back. Good. She's back. Excellent.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay,
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Great.
Okay.
Go ahead, Anna.
Perfect, thank you. So we are going to be presenting with Sarah the preliminary findings of a survey that we conducted in Colombian conflict zones. Can we get to the next slide, please? So very briefly, we have just 20 minutes. We're going to give a brief overview of the project, what we're trying to do, the methodology, and then some of the findings in the survey and some preliminary conclusions. Next, please. And the next, please. Okay, so the main goal of this project is to help or to contribute to understanding of war to peace transitions and the legacies of civil war. So at SESED, we worked on very different initiatives for policy engagement, and part of our work was on research, and we basically did two specific projects. One is this survey that Sarah and I will be presenting on, and the other one is a fantastic fieldwork that María Alejandra Vélez, the director of SESED, conducted to better understand the implementation of PENIS in specific territories within Colombia, and she will be talking about that at the end. So the next, please. So this survey is part of a longer project where we created a longitudinal study of Colombian communities both during and after the war. And to our knowledge, this is the first longitudinal study of this kind, where we are following communities with very rich information on how they experienced the war. And then after a peace agreement and after the mobilization of armed actors, we continue to follow them to see how those trajectories play out and to try to understand variation in the challenges and opportunities that they face. So this started with fieldwork that I conducted in 2010 and 2012, where we collected a lot of detailed information on wartime dynamics. Then in 2016, a few months prior to the demobilization of the FARC, we conducted a survey with residents of the same communities. And back in the fall of 2021, we conducted the survey that we're going to be presenting on. The next one, please. And the focus here on this for this project is really on the role of illicit economies and how they really mediate the trajectories of these communities. So we try to understand how the legacies of war and the challenges for these communities depend to some extent on the specific attributes of illicit economies. Next, please. So I'll say a little bit about methodology, but we are happy to answer questions that people have in the chat later on. So next, please. Thank you. So our goal was to sample communities with armed group presence. And so to do that, next, please, we selected a sample of municipalities in Colombia that had at least 6 months of presence of armed actors at some point in the past. And we stratified that sample by different factors so that we had variation along different dimensions in the country. And what we have is a representative sample in many regions of the country that endure the presence of the guerrillas or the paramilitaries or both. Now, within each of these municipalities, we selected the cabecera, or the county seat. So we always study what is happening with the local government. And we also selected a couple of rural communities. So in each municipality, we can look also at variation within the same municipality that has been exposed to the same local government and often to the same historical conditions. Next, please. Within each community, we randomly sampled households, and within each household, we interviewed one person who was at least 25 years old. Next, please. So the survey, of course, was delayed 3 times because of COVID. We were finally able to implement it in November and December when COVID cases were low in Colombia, and we just received the data literally a few days ago. So what you're going to see is our main preliminary findings. Next, please. A word on COVID: we followed strict protocols to protect our enumerators and our respondents. Next, please. Okay, so we are going to present a few of the main results of the survey and some of the conclusions that we already have. Next, please. So we start with demographic characteristics, just so that you have an idea of who we were talking to. Next, please. In terms of gender, about half of our sample were women, half of them were men. And in terms of in terms of ethnicity, we have around 30% of our respondents identifying themselves as members of an ethnic minority. So we overrepresented, if you look at the distribution of the population in the country, we overrepresented ethnic minorities. Next, please. In terms of age, we have a wide distribution across age groups. Of course, as with the country at large, most of them are young. Next, please. We also have variation in terms of education. Most of our sample completed secondary school at the most. Next, please. And we asked different questions about violence during the war. We're just going to show very summarized statistics. Next, please. So we find that almost 18% of our respondents stated that they or their families were victims of a major violent event during the war. It's important also to note that around 17% also were unsure or did not respond. So they didn't say we were not victims. So this means that around 1 out of 5 people in these communities were actually directly affected by violence during the war. Next, please. And if we look at the types of violence, these are not minor events. A lot of them were victims of dispossession of land or belongings or forced displacement. And around 5%, which is really high, were victims, or their families were victims of homicide, massacre, or for disappearance. So there's a lot of variation across communities, but on average, we're dealing with communities that have been quite traumatized in terms of violence. Next, please. We asked about security conditions in these communities, both during the war and after the signing of the peace agreement, and we're just going to share with you a couple of those findings. Next, please. So we asked our respondents how free they felt to engage in different types of behaviors under the presence of armed actors, and then also today. And we find first that they felt their basic freedom to be quite limited under the presence of armed actors. Again, there is a lot of variation across communities, but on average, people felt quite limited to vote for the preferred candidate, to run for election, to practice their religion, to assemble peacefully, to move around the municipality or their department as they wanted, to express their ideas, to create a community group, to choose a political party, and even to choose a partner. The good news is that people feel that their freedom along all these different activities has really improved after the signing of the peace agreement. Next, please. We also asked about perceptions of safety, and we find that there is still a long way to go. A lot of people feel unsafe or just a little safe, and we find that people are more unsafe or feel more unsafe in urban settings than in rural communities. Next, please. Now, despite rural communities feeling a little bit safer, they are more often the victims of threats, attacks, or killings of social leaders. And actually, one third of the communities, the rural communities, report some kind of violence against the social leaders in their community. So as we all know, this is a major phenomenon and a major challenge for the country. And now I turn it to Sarah Moore, who is my co-author in this project, and she will share some of the findings.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for everybody that is tuning in today. So in addition to gathering some data on the changes in conflict-related dynamics, we also gathered data in these communities related to more day-to-day elements and livelihoods of individuals related to their socioeconomic situations, their relationships with their communities, their reported political participation, and so on. We also really want to know how wartime might have influenced these more mundane aspects of life, as well as how these factors mediate other consequences of conflict exposure. Next slide, please. To that end, we collected data on household socioeconomic indicators. Among these, we find that most of our respondents identified their economic class to be either poor or lower middle class. Next slide, please. As a further gauge of socioeconomic scarcity, we find that 31% of respondents stated that they don't make enough to cover household and minimum income or household minimum expenses. Additionally, 19.8, which is quite a large percent of individuals, stated that their household has gone without food or groceries at some point in the last month. So really the relative scarcity that we are dealing with in some of these communities, while varied, is quite significant. Next slide, please. Additionally, following practice of some other major regional surveys, such as the Latin American Public Opinion Project, we asked respondents to identify which items their household has as a nuanced measure of wealth. Most respondents stated that among this list of items that you see here, that their household has at least one. However, access to important elements of contemporary life, such as internet service, which happened to be incredibly important for students to be able to attend school in the past couple of years, or have some access out to their peers, or even means of transportation, are still very minimally accessible to a majority of respondents. Next slide, please. Aside from economic determinants, access to state and private provision of goods and services is really important for understanding the daily political realities of individuals and varied types of conflict. So next slide, please. Here we collected data on household access to various types of basic services. This table lists all of the services that we asked for. And as you can see, the only service that is near ubiquitous in its availability is electricity at 91.4%. However, the remainder of services still have a really wide range in their degree of accessibility, and none of them are accessible to greater than 3/4 of the population or of the sample. Next slide, please. We then asked about satisfaction regarding a number of these publicly available services in respondent municipalities, or even their more local communities. Each of these measures of satisfaction was scaled from 1 to 6, where 1 is completely unsatisfied and 6 is completely satisfied. Regarding how people would rate their state-provided health services, over a majority of respondents indicated that they were mostly unsatisfied with these health services, as the weight of the graph is more shifted to the left-hand side. Regarding public education, next slide, please. Here, a majority of individuals seem to run along the median, that is a rating of 3 to 4, indicating that people are not particularly satisfied or not particularly dissatisfied with public education in their municipality. Next slide, please. And lastly, we asked about dispute resolution in respondent local communities, which is actually a quite interesting and important part of our research agenda here. Responses here mirror public education in that people are neither particularly satisfied nor dissatisfied, indicating instead that responses tend towards the median between 3 and 4. Next slide, please. The 2016 peace agreement contained resolutions toward broader political participation, especially in rural areas. Therefore, it will be important to understand how wartime politics and social order might have posed challenges to implementation of these specific resolutions related to political behavior and political participation. Next slide, please. Regarding people's perceptions of Colombian democracy, generally, people seem to be more unsatisfied than not with how democracy works throughout the country. This is also significantly different across rural and urban areas. Respondents in urban areas indicated that they are more dissatisfied with Colombian democracy than rural respondents. However, when we turn to how democratic respondents believe their municipality and community to be, we find that people seem to think slightly more positively. as people rate their municipality and their community to be in the median with respect to degree of democracy when rating on a scale from 1 to 6. However, this still shows that the average perception of democracy, even at local levels, is still quite low. Next slide, please. Aside from people's opinions regarding how politics work, we also wanted to know how much people are actually getting involved in politics as well, both directly and indirectly. Reported participation was relatively high in the most recent presidential and local elections. However, when we disaggregate these reported voting trends by self-reported victimization status, the results are even more interesting, especially given the growing literature on political participation after exposure to violence and violent conflict. People that identified that they or someone in their immediate family were victims or had been victimized by some sort of conflict-related violence were reported at voting at rates 11% higher than those that did not identify themselves as having been victimized. However, we do want to add the caveat here that these reported participation rates in electoral activities are a little bit higher than the country average, and therefore we do think that people are over-reporting their participation status. Next slide, please. While voting seems to be a relevant political outlet for most people in our sample, other forms of non-voting political participation seem to yield more modest participation, as the highest category of participation in non-voting political action is only 27.5%. And that is people stating that they participated in demonstration. However, that still indicates that nearly a third of people in the sample are engaged in some form of non-voting political action that we can assume is taking place at either the local community or municipal level. Next slide, please. Another indicator of likelihood to engage in formal political institutions might be attitudes towards those institutions themselves. These attitudes will also be pertinent to understanding which communities require more attention towards the end of reconciliation. Therefore, we ask people to indicate which emotions that they might feel towards the state, that is, the emotional affects they have when thinking about the state. Among the listed emotions were both positive and negative emotions. Individuals overwhelmingly associated negative emotions towards the state, that is, the emotions on the bottom half of the graph. Indifference was chief among them at 35.5%. Respondents were also able to provide their own responses. Next slide, please. And this word cloud, while in Spanish, still offers some glimpse at how people responded. So this is indicating that the relative frequency of each response is how many people chose or listed this response as how they feel towards the state. So the largeness of the words is impactful for how many people responded. So this is stating that a lot of people indicated that they feel disappointment or sadness or abandonment when they thought about the state. Next slide, please. When talking more concretely about specific institutions within the state, people stated that the treatment of community by the military and police that were present in the area were either normal or good. This is a positive outlook on relationships between formal institutions of the state, specifically coercive institutions. However, we do see that it appears that the stated relationship between military and the military and communities is higher than that between the police, which the police tends to a little more towards just a normal kind of working relationship between communities and the police forces. Next slide, please. We additionally asked people to report their participation in the 2016 plebiscite regarding whether or not people agree that there should be a negotiated end to conflict. In our sample, 42.8% were sure they voted. Among those 42.8% of voters, 72% indicated that they had voted yes in the plebiscite. This indicates among those willing to engage in the peace process, a large majority of respondents that were exposed to a variety of conflict dynamics were willing to support the peace process. However, we do see still that a significant degree of support is still shifted, and the significant degree of voters still said no in the plebiscite. Next slide, please. To that point, we also asked individuals to state their degree of agreement with a few statements regarding peace and reconciliation on a scale from 1 to 6. Again, the scale being completely disagree on the 1 side, and then 6 being completely agree. Respondent average responses were along the median along each of these. The first one was that people supported a negotiated end, not military, to the conflict. The second one was that reconciliation with FARC is possible. The third one being that ex-guerrillas should never hold public office. And the fourth one being that the peace accords guarantee truth, justice, and non-repetition to the victims of the conflict. As I stated, the responses here are between the 3 and the 4, which means that people are not particularly in agreement with this, nor are they in disagreement. However, whenever we look at the individual distributions of these statements, which were just too much for one slide, we see that the distribution of responses is quite dispersed. And so this indicates that there's really not an agreement between people as in regards to their agreement towards these statements. So people are really not sure what to make of each of these statements one by one. Next slide, please.
And Sarah, we're going to have to skip one of the 2 sections to make sure we don't take time away from Alejandra, okay?
Okay, that sounds good. Then I will skip the next couple of slides, please, until we can get to local power and authority. This one, yes. And then lastly, in places where armed groups once governed, a crucial factor to maintaining sustainable peace will be who has replaced these power vacuums. Next slide, please. When asked about which actors are most influential in their community now, 44.9% stated the municipal government. However, other non-state actors still seem to have a significant degree of influence, such as people with money and religious leaders. Next slide, please. However, I will say in that graph, a positive note is that locally armed group commanders don't have significant influence in these communities anymore, at least to the degree that people are reporting their influence. We also made the issues of local influence concrete by asking survey participants which leaders were most consequential in developing a response to COVID. In both cases, both economically and just in the general response, people responded that the municipal government was most important. However, a significant degree of people also reported that they had no leadership regarding general response to COVID, nor regarding economic health. Next slide, please. And next slide, please.
Okay, so I'll take just 1.5 minutes to lay out some of our conclusions. Next slide, please. So the first thing to note is that some conditions have improved in many communities. For example, perceptions of freedom, the actual level of influence of armed actors on local communities, and the levels of violence. Next slide, please. Security, of course, as we all know, continues to be a challenge in many of these territories, but it is important to keep in mind that there is a lot of variation, right? So when we say that the conditions are terrible everywhere after the signing of the peace agreement, that's not true. And of course, when we say that violence in general or in the country has really decreased, that's not true either. There is substantial variation. Next, please. There are structural conditions that are very problematic in all of the communities that we studied: high levels of poverty, low levels of service provision, and a conflictual relationship with the state. Next, please. And the next one, please, so that we don't take more time. And so to conclude, we think that this substantial variation across communities in many domains really have to be considered seriously. Understanding the challenges and opportunities that we face in these different contexts is essential to really advance the design and implementation of policies and to really hear the voices of the people who live in these areas and who are really facing very different kinds of obstacles for development and for peace. We already see in our data that borderland communities are particularly vulnerable. And the focus of our research, the next steps will be to really see how illicit economies mediate the effects of the war and really shape the trajectories of these different communities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I was planning to share my screen. Is that possible? So I can just manually.
Yeah, just go ahead and do that now.
Okay. Yeah, can you see it now?
Yes, that's it.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead. So thank you for the organizers for giving me the space to present these preliminary thoughts about the crop substitution challenges in environmental strategic areas in Colombia. This is a joint project with Juliana Rubiano at CESET, and we had the collaboration of Viso Mutuo and Pedro Arenas to be able to conduct this fieldwork. This is part of a bigger research interest, trying to understand the challenges in the substitution program in Colombia, but here I'm just going to tell you about some thoughts about the challenges in the strategic areas, environmental strategic areas. So some of you may know this already, but just to point it out, 48% of the coca crops in Colombia are located in special management zones, that is forest reserves, national parks, indigenous reserves, and Afro-Colombian collective lands. Although there is a literature that is showing that coca crops are not the most important deforestation driver in the country, it is still an important driver, especially an indirect driver. And the fact that coca crops are located in these environmental sensitive areas is still an issue and a threat for biodiversity and cultural wise as well. So I wanted to show you what happened when the substitution program arrived to these areas in trying to substitute the coca crops. So again, to give you an overview, although most of the people here already know that, the National Crop Substitution Program started in 2017, and more than 99,000 households signed the agreements to eradicate coca. Out of those households, only 20% are living in strategic management zones, although I already showed you that almost half of the coca is in these strategic areas. I'm not going to go through the components of the crop substitution program in details, but it has an immediate food assistance, food security project, short cycle project, a long cycle project, and a technical assistance. And part of the problem here is that it has an agropecuarian focus, which shouldn't be the case in areas that are strategic in environmental terms. So this program, the substitution program, didn't consider a differential approach. Only in 2019 and 2020, there were guidelines to implement the program in protected areas. Recently, they developed the guidance to implement the program in ethnic communities, but actually, everything is still in paper. They haven't implemented these new guidelines that consider the differential approach. The program didn't consider land use overlap conflicts or land tenure disputes between the program before signing the agreements, and I'm going to show you that this basically created a mess in the field. So we have peasants living inside indigenous reserves. We have indigenous groups living outside their reserves and coexisting with peasants. And we have peasants living in national park or forest reserves. And when the crop substitution program pennies signed the agreements, didn't consider all these type of land overlaps and conflicts. So as I just mentioned, in 2020, they did develop some guidelines to have a more sensitive and differential program, but it's still in paper. So they have included already some conservation incentives, some guidance for sustainable production systems, but this has not implemented yet in the field. Beyond environmental concerns, households in this area live under multidimensional poverty. At least in national park, 56% of households are in multidimensional poverty, 51% in Afro-Colombian poverty regimes, and 53% in indigenous reserves. So it's not only, of course, an environmental concern, is that if this program is not responding to the needs of this household, it's not going to do much better. So we did some case studies to understand these dilemmas of how is to implement the substitution program in regions that are sensitive in environmental terms. And we did 2 case studies in Putumayo with peasant coca growers living inside Inga indigenous reserves, as with NASA coca growers that declined to enroll in pennies because there was an ethnic approach. And we also did this fieldwork in Guaviare with peasant coca growers living inside Nucac Indigenous Reserve, and with peasant coca growers living inside Amazon Forest Reserve, and with Nucac coca harvesters are waiting for a differentiated approach. So in Putumayo and Guaviare, we have these dilemmas that I just mentioned. So we did, I'm not gonna go through this because I don't have time, but we did some social cartography workshop and some interviews in which we were in both cases trying to do the same, and is to understand the challenges of implementing pennies in these indigenous and forest reserve areas. So I'm just gonna go quickly through the challenges. First, peasant coca growers living inside indigenous reserve got suspended from the program without previous warning. So the peasants signed coca crop substitution agreements, eradicated the coca, received initial payments, but when they were going to receive the productive projects, they were suspended because they were living inside indigenous reserves, something that should be cleared out before their agreements. In some cases, local indigenous authorities didn't allow peasants living inside their collective lands to enter the crop substitution program. So now in the case of the peasant, the alternative is that they should rent land outside indigenous reserve or outside the forest reserve to remain in the program. That means, of course, an additional cost for the peasants. And in some cases, what we found out is that family, in fact, rented the new line outside the special management zone, but the program didn't arrive. I mean, the productive projects didn't arrive. So, you know, the pennies, the substitution program didn't solve nor plan to solve all the land conflicts or tension before signing the agreement. And of course, that was a mistake. Indigenous reserves and forest reserve delimitation didn't consider the presence of diverse communities and land uses. Of course, this is not a problem of the substitutional program, but they arrived in a context that this was not solved. So this exacerbated the mistrust towards Colombian government. In other cases, peasants don't recognize the presence of indigenous people inside legally constituting indigenous reserves. As you can see on the right in Putumayo, peasants are located in the resguardo, but they're only considered that the indigenous live in a very small place. So there is a conflict between different territorial visions. For many peasants living inside indigenous resguardos, they think it has been very unjust that they have received the titling because they don't work on their land and they get titles. So there is a tension between peasants and indigenous communities in this area that it was not caused necessarily by the program, substitution program, but it was when it was implemented, this program didn't solve these issues. The second challenges are the unexpected requirements to remain in the program, in the pennies program, for peasants living inside forest reserves. So they signed, as I said before, they signed their agreements, they eradicated the coca, but then when the productive project was going to arrive, the program told the peasants, okay, you have to sign nature conservation agreements and you have to clarify the land use rights before receiving the productive project. Of course, for the peasant perspective, this is perceived as a change in the rules of the game because it was not explained before entering the program. Peasants have a lack of clarity about the official delimitation regarding forest reserves areas that have different restrictions depending on if they're type A or type B. So right now, the point is that the government can guarantee the implementation of substitution programs. With current regulations, they must change, and peasants must change cattle for conservation activities or agro-sustainable cattle ranching. And when the peasants signed the contracts to eradicate the coca, they were expecting to be able to do cattle ranching. So now current regulations forbid, for example, road constructions and infrastructure within forest reserve areas. And for peasants, then cattle ranching is the only options. The third challenge is the lack of a differential ethnic approach. Currently, most of ethnic communities enrolled in the pennies haven't received benefits. Some ethnic communities decided not to enroll to the pennies because of the absence of a differential ethnic approach. But some of those communities did sign the agreements and haven't received the projects. Now, of course, prior consultation must occur with indigenous communities to establish beneath components and characteristics. And right now, it's not clear if at what level to conduct that prior consultation. There is a overlap of multiple regulations and strategies in the same territories, and this is an issue. I don't have time to go through the details of the case, for example, of the Nucac reserves. I can happy to answer those questions. So just to end with some reflection, a future curb substitution program in sustainable management zone should clarify land rights and solve tenure and use of conflicts as a first step before signing substitution agreement with communities. It needs to design and socialize requirements for each special management zone at the beginning of the program, which it didn't occur. And but it has to acknowledge as well that conservation activities are not necessarily embedded in the coca growers' culture. Right now, the dream alternative of most of the peasant living in these reserve zones were cattle ranching. And now this is impossible to accomplish for the environmental regulation. So it needs technical assistance and to shift their preferences. And of course, there is a lack of institutional coordination in all the institutions that are trying to be implementing their projects in the area. So yeah, I'm gonna stop here because I don't think I have more time. Thank you.